true crime, the yogurt shop murders, the closing routine, and the open back door. The chilling crime that sent innocent men to prison. The key is still in the front door. Inside the narrow yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane, the chairs have been lifted onto the tables. The public area is being cleaned. Money from the register is supposed to be counted in the preparation room and secured in a safe set into the floor. Equipment must be washed, food stored, and the shop prepared for the next morning. Yet the back door, normally locked and accessible from outside, only with the manager's key, will be found open. The front door key will remain in the lock. The closing work will stop somewhere between routine and departure. The life before the case. Jennifer Harbison is 17 years old and works at the "I can't believe it's yogurt" store in a North Austin strip mall. Her mother later describes Jennifer and her younger sister Sarah as lovely people with a close bond. Jennifer enjoys working alongside Eliza Thomas, another 17-year-old employee who is helping close the store that Friday. Eliza is social, energetic, and interested in fashion and fitness. Her younger sister remembers her as a teenager, still working out who she is, experimenting with style and moving toward adult independence. That description matters because criminal cases often freeze young people at the age shown in a photograph. Eliza is not yet a symbol, a headline, or a name repeated in court. She is a teenager, working an evening shift. Sarah Harbison is 15. Amy Ayers is 13 and plans to spend the night with her. Amy's family describes her as a cowgirl and an old soul who is involved with the Future Farmers of America. Through that organization and the overlapping friendships around the older girls, Amy belongs naturally within the group despite being the youngest. The public record contains more detail about the investigation than about the private lives of the four girls. That imbalance is common in old homicide cases. Police interviews, laboratory reports, motions, and appellate opinions survive in organized files. Personality often survives through fragments carried by relatives. What can be established is ordinary and specific. Jennifer and Eliza are working. Sarah and Amy have spent time at the nearby North Cross Mall and come to the shop to wait for Jennifer's ride home. A sleepover is planned. Closing time is 11 p.m. The girls are not entering an obviously dangerous place. They are moving between the familiar parts of teenage life, work, friends, sisters, a shopping mall, and a planned night together. That ordinariness later made the case feel intimate to Austin. The setting was not remote. It was not hidden behind high walls or connected to an underworld most people could imagine avoiding. It was a brightly branded dessert store in a commercial strip. Parents had dropped children at similar places. Teenagers had worked similar shifts. The interruption came inside a routine so recognizable that the unfinished details would become almost impossible to forget. The people around them. The relationships inside the store are uncomplicated on the surface. Jennifer and Sarah are sisters. Sarah and Amy are friends. Jennifer and Eliza are co-workers. The two younger girls are not customers in the usual sense by closing time. They are waiting for Jennifer and helping occupy the final part of the evening. The four are connected through family, friendship, work, and the expectation that they will soon leave together. Outside the shop, family members know where the girls are meant to be. There is no initial reason to interpret the arrangement as a disappearance or an emergency. The planned journey home is short enough and normal enough that concern depends on the routine failing. Other people pass through the store during the evening. Court records later describe a private security company owner who parks a marked vehicle outside at about 10 p.m. He recalls a teenage male asking whether he is a police officer, refusing to approach the counter, and requesting use of the restroom. Eliza's mother, who is visiting her daughter at the store, remembers that young man with another male. Another customer recalls two teenage males, one of whom appears to be handling something inside a bag. Those observations would become important years later, but their value was never simple. None provided a reliable identification of the person ultimately connected to the physical evidence. Memories were tested after time had passed. Photo arrays did not produce firm identification of the men later prosecuted. A suspicious manner is not the same as a verified identity. The store itself also becomes part of the supporting cast. Court testimony describes a deep, narrow unit. The public area occupies roughly the front 2/3. Behind the counter, a doorway leads into preparation, storage, office, and restroom space. The front door uses a double-cylinder deadbolt. The rear door normally stays locked, and the manager holds the only outside key. That design creates a practical question before it creates a criminal one. Anyone leaving through the rear could reach the alley. Anyone entering from outside would usually need the door opened from within. The people around the girls could explain why they were there. The building could explain how closing was supposed to work. Neither could yet explain why the back door was open. The first detail that did not fit. Closing a frozen yogurt store requires a sequence. One employee locks the front door while keeping the key in the deadbolt. Chairs are stacked. The floor is swept and mopped. The register drawer is carried into the preparation area, where the cash is counted and a report printed. Money is placed in the floor safe. Products go into refrigeration. Machines and serving equipment are cleaned. The employees eventually leave through the front, lock it again, and push the key back beneath the door in an envelope. That evening, part of the sequence appears to have begun. Chairs are stacked. The key remains in the front lock. The process has advanced far enough to show that the girls are preparing to leave, but it does not reach its normal ending. The rear door creates the sharper contradiction. It can be opened from inside using its thumb latch, but an outsider should not possess a key. When the scene is examined, the rear exit is open. That makes several possibilities conceivable. Someone already inside may have opened it. Someone may have slipped through before closing. An employee could have opened it for an innocent reason. An intruder could have used it to leave. No responsible reconstruction can settle that question from the door alone. An open exit does not prove whether one person or several were involved. It does not identify when the door was unlocked. It cannot establish whether the people remembered by customers were connected to what followed. Yet it changes the geography. The front of the shop faces the commercial parking area. The rear offers a less visible route. The door, therefore, becomes more than a physical feature. It is a point at which the normal closing procedure no longer accounts for the scene. The cash also complicates a simple robbery theory. Later accounts indicate money was missing, but the scale and conduct of the crime were drastically out of proportion to a routine theft from a small store. If robbery began the encounter, it did not explain everything that happened inside. If robbery was only incidental, motive became harder to define. Nothing in the girls' known plans suggests that they expect an extended delay. Amy is supposed to stay with Sarah. Jennifer is the ride home. Eliza's shift should end with the store secured. The last ordinary details do not look dramatic: stacked chairs, cleaning work, a key left where employees expect to use it. Their power comes from incompletion. The last ordinary movements. Friday, December 6th, 1991, narrows gradually. Jennifer and Eliza report for work at the yogurt shop. Sarah and Amy spend time at North Cross Mall before walking to the store. They are waiting for Jennifer to finish, so the group can leave together. Amy intends to stay overnight with Sarah. Customers continue to enter during the later evening. A security company owner arrives at approximately 10 p.m. and remains for around 20 minutes. He remembers the young male, who asks whether he is a police officer and then requests the restroom. Eliza's mother also places that young man with another male. A separate witness recalls two young men whose behavior makes her uncomfortable. These sightings became woven into later theories, but they contained serious limits. The witnesses did not observe the central event. They could not establish that the young men remained in the shop after customers left. The descriptions did not ultimately connect Robert Springsteen or Michael Scott to the location through a positive identification, nor did they identify the man whose DNA would be recovered from the scene. The most useful early chronology comes from the store, rather than from eyewitness certainty. Closing time is 11 p.m. The state appellate record later places the emergency response at 11:47 p.m. That leaves a restricted interval in which the customers depart, the doors are managed, the closing routine begins, and control inside the shop changes. The narrowness, the shop, matters. The front area can be viewed from the counter. The rear spaces are more secluded. A person entering the back portion could be out of sight of passing motorists and much of the strip mall frontage. The scene also suggests that the girls were moved or controlled in the rear of the business. 4 teenagers would not be easy to dominate without a weapon, surprise, or both. Later investigators concluded that a lone offender was capable of doing so, based partly on the conduct seen in his other crimes. At this stage, however, that conclusion does not exist. There is only a store approaching closure, and a limited period with no surviving witness able to describe it. A patrol officer is driving near West Anderson Lane shortly before midnight when fire becomes visible from the yogurt shop. The ordinary timeline ends there. The next information arrives through smoke, water, and an emergency call. The first alarm. The Austin officer reports the fire to dispatch. Firefighters reach the shop and begin suppression. The automatic sprinkler system has already added water to a scene being damaged by heat and smoke. Once crews move into the rear, they discover 4 bodies. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers are dead. All 4 have been shot. They are found nude, bound, and gagged. The official police account states that the fire and the water used to extinguish it make evidence recovery difficult from the beginning. Homicide investigators and crime scene personnel collect what they can from a scene in which an offender appears to have tried to destroy the physical record. Medical and court evidence later establishes that Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza suffered fatal gunshot wounds to the back of the head from a .22 caliber weapon. Amy is found apart from the other 3. One .22 caliber shot does not cause the fatal injury. She is also shot with a .380 caliber firearm. The distinction between those weapons becomes critically important decades later. The scene shows sexual assault. Restraints are made from the girls' clothing. The fire is concentrated in the rear area around the victims. An arson investigator initially concludes that it began on storage shelving and spread through the structure, but a later federal review of burn patterns leads to the conclusion that it began on the bodies. The original investigator accepts that revised interpretation after reviewing the analysis. The central event can be described only to the extent the evidence allows. An armed person gains control after or near closing. The girls are taken toward the back. They are restrained, sexually assaulted, and shot. Fire is then set in an apparent effort to damage the scene and conceal evidence. The record does not provide a verified transcript of what was said. It does not establish a complete minute-by-minute order for every assault. It cannot directly record the offender's motive. The physical evidence shows brutality and control. It does not disclose private thought. Families are notified during the early hours. The 4 teenagers who were expected to leave together are now at the center of a quadruple homicide investigation. The open back door no longer looks like an unfinished closing task. It becomes a possible route through the crime. The search for an explanation. Austin police confront a case with enormous public pressure and badly compromised evidence. Thousands of tips arrive. Dozens of people claim responsibility. Some confessions are quickly exposed as impossible because the speakers do not know the protected details of the scene. The volume creates activity without necessarily creating accuracy. Every false account consumes time and raises the danger that confidence may become attached to the wrong narrative. 8 days after the crime, 16-year-old Maurice Pierce is arrested at North Cross Mall while carrying a loaded .22 caliber revolver. It is the same make and model as one of the weapons used in the yogurt shop. That coincidence places him immediately under intense scrutiny. After hours of interrogation, Pierce gives an account implicating himself. Yet when homicide detective John Jones interviews him the following morning, the details do not match the scene. Ballistic examination of Pierce's gun is inconclusive, rather than identifying it as the murder weapon. The confession is therefore not treated as a reliable solution at that time. Pierce has named friends who were with him around Northcross Mall: Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Welborn. All are teenagers. Police interview them in December 1991. They deny involvement, and investigators, overwhelmed by competing leads, do not build a prosecution around them. Other theories circulate. The extreme violence leads people to consider experienced offenders. The nearby mall sightings focus attention on local teenagers. The sexual assaults suggest that robbery alone is inadequate. The fire suggests planning, or at least a deliberate attempt to erase evidence. Two different guns may suggest more than one assailant, although a single offender could carry both. That last distinction becomes important. The assumption of multiple offenders can shape how every later clue is interpreted. If investigators believe 4 girls could not have been controlled by one person, they may search for a group. If they search for a group, statements mentioning several people may appear to fit, even when the physical evidence does not. The investigation accumulates boxes, interviews, laboratory submissions, witness recollections, and claims. It does not accumulate a physical match to Pierce, Springsteen, Scott, or Welborn. For years, the case remains active without becoming clearer. The first simple explanation, that young men near the mall committed a robbery that escalated, has emotional and narrative force. What it lacks is forensic confirmation. The confessions that appeared to solve everything. In 1998, Austin police form a task force to review the case. One of the old leads revived is the group surrounding Maurice Pierce. Michael Scott is contacted first and gives an innocent account of his movements. In September 1999, officers ask him to meet for another interview. Scott arrives voluntarily. What begins as a planned short conversation becomes a prolonged interrogation, conducted across several days. Videotaped questioning alone lasts about 18 hours. He is taken to the former shop location, driven around Austin in an unsuccessful search for a bridge, and brought to a creek bed where he says a pistol was buried. No weapon is recovered there. Scott eventually gives a detailed statement, in which he places himself, Springsteen, Pierce, and Welborn in a planned robbery. He says the rear door was opened earlier to permit re-entry. He describes guns, restraints, shootings, a fire, and a stop at a bridge afterward. Police then interview Springsteen in West Virginia. His questioning lasts approximately 5 hours and is videotaped. He too gives an incriminating account, naming the same group and describing entry through the rear door, sexual assault, a silver .380 caliber handgun, a shooting, and a later stop near a bridge. At trial, prosecutors would emphasize similarities between the two statements. Both contain the rear door route, the 2 weapon types, the trip involving a stolen sport utility vehicle, the newspaper account, and the bridge where someone became sick. Some details corresponded to elements that police regarded as non-public. Yet the confessions also carried warning signs. Both men recanted and maintained that investigators had pressured or supplied information to them. There was no physical evidence connecting either to the scene. Some details were wrong or unstable. The prosecution theory required multiple offenders, while later forensic work would repeatedly indicate one unknown male biological contributor. A confession can be powerful without being accurate. Long interrogation, suggestion, contamination by case information, exhaustion, fear, and the belief that cooperation offers the only exit can produce statements that sound persuasive because they contain real details. The legal question is not simply whether a person said the words. It is how those words were produced, which details originated independently, and whether objective evidence supports them. The renewed task force interprets the 2 statements as corroborating one another. Scott, Springsteen, Pierce, and Wellborn are arrested for capital murder in 1999. The investigation has finally produced accused men. It has not produced their DNA, fingerprints, weapons, or other physical traces inside the shop. The event, at the center of the case. The later forensic record allows a more reliable reconstruction than the confessions did, but it remains incomplete. Near closing time, one offender appears to gain access to the back portion of the yogurt shop. The exact method is unresolved. Witnesses had noticed young males earlier in the evening, but no witness identified the offender later tied to the physical evidence. The rear door may have been opened from inside, entered through after being left unsecured, or used only as an exit. Once customers are gone, a firearm provides control. The girls are moved into the employee area and restrained using their own clothing. The offender sexually assaults at least 3 of them. The evidence indicates prolonged domination, rather than a sudden exchange during a straightforward robbery. Jennifer, Sarah, and Eliza are shot fatally with a .22 caliber weapon. Amy is shot with both a .22 caliber and a .380 caliber firearm. Her position apart from the others, the second shot, and biological material recovered beneath her fingernails later support the inference that she resisted or came into close physical contact with the attacker. The offender sets fire around the victims before leaving. The building's sprinklers activate. Firefighters add more water. Heat, smoke, water, movement by emergency personnel, and the original limitations of early 1990s forensic technology all reduce what can be recovered and interpreted. What the physical record proves is narrower than any omniscient version of the scene. It establishes restraint, sexual assault, gunfire from 2 weapon types, close contact, and deliberate fire setting. It does not establish the exact spoken exchanges. It cannot show whether the original intent was robbery, sexual assault, murder, or some combination that evolved after entry. It also does not require 4 offenders. That conclusion became easier to understand only after investigators studied the later crimes associated with Robert Eugene Brasher's. Police said those offenses showed that he acted alone, used weapons to control victims, restrained them with available clothing, committed sexual violence, and sometimes set fires. By 2025, investigators said they had no evidence that another person joined him inside the yogurt shop. The public assumption that 4 victims required 4 attackers had helped make the group confession theory seem intuitively plausible. The later forensic theory was different. One experienced armed offender could impose control through surprise, fear, and threatened violence. The evidence still cannot reveal every movement. It cannot prove one specific motive. It cannot explain why the offender selected that store or why he was in Austin. Those uncertainties survived even after identity became much clearer. The crime could be reconstructed through wounds, DNA, ballistics, fire patterns, and the store layout. It could not be replayed as a complete scene. When the story entered the courtroom, Robert Springsteen is tried first. Prosecutors use his confession and excerpts from Scott's statement to argue that the 2 accounts reinforce one another. In May 2001, a jury convicts Springsteen of capital murder. He receives a death sentence. Michael Scott is tried separately the following year. His long-recorded interrogation becomes central to the prosecution. Jurors also hear an edited account of Springsteen's statement. Scott is convicted in September 2002. Because the jury does not unanimously impose death, he is sentenced to life imprisonment. Maurice Pierce remains jailed for years, but is not tried. His charges are dismissed for insufficient evidence. 2 grand juries declined to indict Forrest Wellborn, meaning the state cannot proceed against him on the case presented. The trials do not answer the physical evidence problem. No crime scene evidence links any of the 4 men to the shop. The convictions rest heavily on statements, and the prosecution's claim that shared details demonstrate insider knowledge. A separate constitutional problem emerges. At each trial, prosecutors use material from a person who is not available for cross-examination, by the defendant's lawyers. The United States Supreme Court's ruling in Crawford v. Washington strengthens the right to confront testimonial evidence offered against an accused person. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rules that using Scott's statement against Springsteen violated Springsteen's confrontation rights, and that the error cannot be treated as harmless. Springsteen's conviction is reversed. The court later reaches the same essential conclusion in Scott's case, finding that the improper use of Springsteen's statement could have affected the verdict. Springsteen's death sentence had already been reduced after the Supreme Court prohibited execution for crimes committed by people under 18. He had been 17 in 1991. The reversal now removes the conviction itself and returns the case for possible retrial. The rulings do not initially declare either man innocent. They decide that the trials were constitutionally unfair. The decisive challenge to the prosecution narrative would come not from courtroom procedure, but from biological material that had survived the fire, the DNA that refused to fit the confessions. By the time prosecutors prepare to retry Springsteen and Scott, DNA science can recover information that was unavailable during the original investigation. Testing produces an unknown male Y-star profile from sexual assault evidence. Y-star analysis focuses on markers carried on the male Y chromosome and can help isolate male genetic material in samples dominated by female DNA. The developed profile contains 16 markers at the time. Michael Scott is excluded. Robert Springsteen is excluded. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn are also excluded. Other testing identifies male profiles on evidence associated with multiple victims, none matching the 4 accused men. The result does not merely fail to support the confession theory. It identifies physical participation by an unknown male whose genetic profile is not represented among the people prosecuted. Prosecutors initially consider whether that unidentified man might be an additional offender, rather than evidence that the entire group theory is wrong. Such a possibility cannot be rejected solely because one unknown profile exists. But the logic becomes increasingly strained. No physical evidence ties the 4 known defendants to the scene, while the strongest biological evidence belongs to someone else. In June 2009, Springsteen and Scott are released on bond. In October, the remaining charges against them are dismissed, pending further investigation. They have spent years incarcerated, one under a death judgment and the other under a life sentence. The dismissal leaves an unusual legal state. The convictions no longer stand, but the men have not yet received formal declarations of actual innocence. The crime remains unresolved. Investigators continue gathering comparison samples from possible suspects and people who can be eliminated. The DNA profile becomes both an answer and a locked door. It says that the physical evidence came from a different man. It does not yet provide his name. Traditional database searches do not produce the complete match needed. Hundreds of comparison samples fail to resolve it. For the victims' families, the case returns to uncertainty. For the 4 accused men, release does not erase the public belief created by the confessions and trials. For investigators, the unknown male profile becomes the most important piece of surviving evidence. The case has moved from a theory built around 4 named teenagers to a question encoded in genetic markers. The long gap between exclusion and identification. After 2009, the case remains open, but loses the momentum of an approaching trial. The unknown profile is repeatedly compared against new samples. Laboratory methods improve. National databases expand. Ballistic systems become more capable of linking cartridge cases across jurisdictions. Yet progress depends on evidence surviving long enough, being selected for renewed examination, and entering the right system at the right time. The first generation of investigators carries the case into retirement. Detective John Jones keeps copies of notes and describes decades of insomnia. Families continue living with an investigation that has produced arrests, convictions, reversals, releases, and no accepted identification. The emotional damage is not confined to the 4 families who lost daughters. Springsteen, Scott, Wellborn, and Pierce remain publicly associated with the crime. Scott and Springsteen must rebuild after imprisonment. Wellborn later describes difficulty maintaining work and housing under the accusation. Pierce is killed in 2010 during a violent confrontation with an Austin police officer following a traffic stop, years before his name is formally cleared. In 2022, Austin cold case detective Daniel Jackson is assigned to the investigation. He consults experts in DNA and forensic genealogy and develops a prioritized list of evidence that may justify retesting. The strategy is not simply to submit everything again. Old evidence is finite. Each test may consume material. Investigators must identify which items offer the greatest chance of producing a usable result. The turning point begins with ballistics. A .380 caliber cartridge found in a drain at the yogurt shop scene had not been entered into the modern National Ballistic System for years. In June 2025, Jackson determines that improved software justifies another submission. The following month, the system produces a connection to an unsolved 1998 killing in Lexington, Kentucky. That link changes the investigation's scale. The cartridge is no longer an isolated artifact from one Austin crime scene. It may have been fired by the same weapon used 7 years later in another state, where a woman named Linda Rutledge was shot in the head and a business was set on fire. The case has finally found a second scene. The case built from DNA and a cartridge. The Kentucky connection allows investigators to compare not just crimes, but biological profiles. Preliminary forensic examination concludes that the spent .380 caliber cartridge cases from Austin and Lexington were fired by the same weapon. DNA from Linda Rutledge's sexual assault evidence later matches the profile associated with the Austin case. Jackson also requests a manual national search of laboratories holding Y-star profiles. The original Austin profile had been developed with fewer markers than more modern profiles, so a straightforward automated database process was not enough. Several laboratories report partial compatibility, but South Carolina holds a full 27-allele Y-star profile corresponding to the Austin evidence. That profile originates from a 1990 sexual assault and murder in Greenville, South Carolina. It belongs to Robert Eugene Brashers. Investigators then test additional evidence. DNA recovered from beneath Amy Ayers's fingernails is reported as consistent with Brashers, with police describing a statistical association of approximately 2.5 million to 1. The nail evidence is significant because it represents close contact at the scene and is separate from the YSTR material developed from sexual assault evidence. The ballistic chronology adds another layer. Less than 48 hours after the yogurt shop murders, Border Patrol officers stop Brashers at a checkpoint between El Paso and Las Cruces. He is driving a stolen vehicle and possesses a .380 caliber pistol of the same make and model used to shoot Amy. Police later confirm through serial numbers that it is the same gun Brashers uses when he dies during a standoff in Missouri in 1999. No single detail needs to carry the entire conclusion. The YSTR evidence connects Brashers's paternal genetic line to biological material from the assaults. The fingernail evidence provides a more individualized association. Ballistics links the Austin cartridge to the Kentucky crime. The DNA from both scenes corresponds. Brashers possessed the relevant model of weapon within 2 days of the Austin murders. His established crimes involve sexual violence, bindings made from victims' clothing, gunshot wounds, and fire setting. This is pattern evidence, strengthened by independent physical strands. Similar conduct alone could not identify Brashers. A gun model alone could not identify him. YSTR alone would identify a paternal line rather than one uniquely individual man. Together with autosomal DNA, matching scene evidence, travel chronology, and weapon history, the case becomes substantially stronger. The trial narrative had depended on confessions corroborating one another. The new narrative depends on forensic evidence corroborating itself. The name that replaced the old theory. On September 29, 2025, Austin police publicly identify Robert Eugene Brashers as the suspect responsible for the yogurt shop murders. Brashers had died in 1999 after shooting himself during a police standoff in Missouri. He could not be arrested, interrogated, or tried. The announcement therefore did not create a conventional prosecution. It created an official identification based on evidence accumulated across several states and several decades. Police describe him as a serial killer and sexual offender already linked through DNA to violent crimes in South Carolina, Tennessee, Missouri, and later Kentucky. The Austin investigation concludes that he most likely acted alone. Investigators acknowledge that they still do not know why he was in Austin, or whether he had any meaningful connection to the city. The sole offender conclusion corrects one of the assumptions that had guided the earlier case. 4 victims did not necessarily require 4 attackers. Brasher's known methods demonstrated that a single armed offender could control multiple people, use their clothing as restraints, commit sexual assault, and destroy evidence by fire. The new identification also changes the meaning of Amy's position and the material beneath her fingernails. Detective Jackson says that Amy's resistance helped solve the case. The statement should not be romanticized into a complete reconstruction of her final experience, but it identifies why that evidence survived as more than an unidentified trace. Close contact preserved a genetic connection that later technology could interpret. The evidence could not produce a verdict because Brasher's was dead. It could not force him to explain motive, entry, victim selection, or the precise sequence inside the rear room. It could not restore the decades during which the wrong men carried public suspicion. What it could do was dismantle the original prosecution theory. The unknown male was no longer an inconvenient 5th participant added to preserve the confessions. He was the man linked across the biological and ballistic evidence. The 4 accused teenagers had not left physical traces because, according to the official conclusion, they were not there. Austin finally had a name. The justice system still had to address what it had done with the wrong ones. The outcome that cleared 4 other names. After police identify Brasher's, the Travis County District Attorney's Conviction Integrity Unit asks the court to change the dismissals in the cases against Scott, Springsteen, Pierce, and Wellborn. The old dismissals had left the matters pending further investigation. The new forensic evidence supports a stronger legal conclusion: actual innocence. Under that standard, the question is not merely whether the earlier trials were flawed. It is whether new affirmative evidence is so powerful that no reasonable jury would convict the accused men. On February 19, 2026, Judge Dana Blasey formally declares all 4 men innocent. Michael Scott and Forrest Wellborn attend. Robert Springsteen does not. Maurice Pierce is cleared posthumously, with his widow and daughter present. Prosecutors acknowledge that the state had been wrong. The declaration matters in several ways. For Scott and Springsteen, it replaces overturned convictions and dismissed charges with an affirmative legal finding. For Wellborn, it addresses an accusation that had survived, despite grand juries refusing to indict him. For Pierce's family, it restores his name after his death. The hearing also recognizes the human consequences that procedural rulings cannot repair: lost years, broken relationships, employment problems, homelessness, public hostility, and the possibility that Springsteen could have been executed before the case was corrected. Actual innocence does not mean every detail of the original investigation is now understood. It means the state accepts that these 4 men did not commit the crime. In May 2026, Austin officials reach a settlement resolving civil claims related to the wrongful arrests and convictions. On May 28, the City Council unanimously approves payments totaling no more than $35 million to Scott, Springsteen, Wellborn, and the estate and family of Pierce. City documents state that the agreement addresses federal civil rights and related claims. The money is compensation, not restoration. It cannot recreate Scott's family life, return Springsteen's years under a death sentence, erase Wellborn's homelessness, or allow Pierce to hear the judgment clearing him. The legal record now says what the physical evidence had been saying for years: the old theory was wrong. The aftermath, people still argue about. The case now contains 2 distinct failures. The first is the original crime and the decades required to identify the man responsible. The second is the investigative and legal process that redirected public certainty toward 4 innocent teenagers. The false confession problem is central. Scott and Springsteen did not merely make brief, spontaneous admissions. They were subjected to lengthy questioning, produced accounts containing both accurate and inaccurate material, recanted, and insisted that information had been supplied or shaped through the interrogation. Their statements were then used to reinforce one another, even though neither man's physical evidence appeared at the scene. The case demonstrates why detail inside a confession cannot automatically be treated as proof that the speaker possesses independent knowledge. Investigators may disclose facts intentionally or unintentionally. Questions can suggest answers. A suspect may adopt an officer's theory, guess correctly, repeat information learned elsewhere, or agree with propositions after hours of resistance. The constitutional reversals were also narrower than the eventual truth. Scott and Springsteen initially won new trials because each had been confronted with the other's testimonial statement without a proper opportunity for cross-examination. That decision protected due process, but it did not yet establish who committed the murders. DNA later transformed the case from unfair conviction to actual innocence. The settlement has renewed discussion about interrogation recording, contamination controls, youth vulnerability, independent review, and the institutional reluctance to abandon a theory once arrests and convictions have been obtained. City leaders have publicly apologized, but accountability cannot be measured only by whether compensation is paid after the evidence becomes overwhelming. For the victims' families, the exonerations do not compete with justice for Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy. Clearing innocent men strengthens the integrity of the answer. A wrongful conviction does not honor a victim. It allows the actual offender to remain unidentified while creating additional victims of state error. The case's most uncomfortable lesson is not that forensic science eventually succeeded. It is that the physical evidence had contradicted the prosecution long before the legal system was prepared to follow it all the way. The questions Robert Brashers cannot answer. Police now attribute the yogurt shop murders to Robert Eugene Brashers, but several important questions remain beyond the reach of a trial. Investigators have not publicly established why he was in Austin. Less than 2 days later, he was stopped hundreds of miles west near the Texas-New Mexico boundary in a stolen vehicle. That proves movement through the region, not why he selected the yogurt shop. The exact method of entry also remains uncertain. Earlier confessions claimed the rear door was deliberately propped open during a preliminary visit, but those statements came from innocent men and cannot safely be transferred into the Brashers' reconstruction. The open back door may still show how he entered or left, but the public evidence does not conclusively reveal when it was opened. Nor is there a verified motive beyond what can be inferred from conduct. Money was reportedly taken, yet the sexual violence and effort to destroy the scene indicate that ordinary robbery is not a complete explanation. Prosecutors would not necessarily have needed to prove one specific motive had Brashers lived to face trial. Identity, intent, causation, and the elements of capital murder would have mattered more than a psychologically satisfying reason. The sole offender conclusion is strong, but remains an investigative finding rather than a jury verdict. Police said they found no evidence of an accomplice and viewed Brashers' other known crimes as demonstrating his ability to act alone. No surviving witness from inside the shop can confirm that. Brashers' death also prevents adversarial testing. A defense could have challenged the statistical weight of the DNA, the continuity of old evidence, ballistic interpretation, travel assumptions, and the use of behavioral similarities. Investigators believe the combined evidence identifies him, and official records now describe him as the perpetrator, but no trial examined those claims through cross-examination. That distinction does not return the case to equal uncertainty. The evidence against Brashers is fundamentally different from the evidence used against Scott and Springsteen. It is physical, cross-jurisdictional, and independently convergent. Yet the final answer is forensic, rather than confessional. The man identified by the evidence cannot explain the open door, the chosen store, or the decision to attack 4 teenagers. Why the key in the door still matters. The key remained in the front door lock because the closing routine had not finished. For years, that small fact sat inside competing stories. The prosecution said a group of local teenagers had entered through the back after preparing the route earlier. The men said the confessions were false. DNA said another male had been present. Improved ballistics connected Austin to Kentucky. Modern testing finally gave the unknown profile a name. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers should not be remembered only through the condition of the scene. Jennifer and Eliza were working together. Sarah and Amy were waiting for a ride and planning a sleepover. Amy was the cowgirl and old soul. Eliza was energetic, social, and interested in fitness and fashion. Jennifer and Sarah were sisters described by their mother as lovely people. The legal aftermath adds 4 more lives to the case without displacing the original 4. Michael Scott lost years under a life sentence. Robert Springsteen came within the reach of execution. Forrest Wellborn lived under an accusation that grand juries had refused to endorse. Maurice Pierce died before a judge restored his name. The yogurt shop murders matter because they show how evidence can be damaged, misunderstood, technologically inaccessible, and still capable of surviving longer than a confident theory. They also show the danger of treating a confession as the destination, rather than one claimed to be tested. The original case tried to make the physical record fit the words. The later investigation allowed DNA and ballistics to determine which words could survive. The shop's closing routine was never completed. More than 3 decades later, the justice system finally completed a different task, identifying the man connected to the evidence and formally clearing the men who were not. The key in the door no longer marks only the moment 4 teenagers failed to leave. It marks the beginning of a case that required Austin to learn, twice, how badly a story can go wrong when certainty arrives before proof.